Good evening. My name is Felipe Correa. I'm an associate professor and the director of the urban design program here at the school. Welcome everyone tonight. I feel the room's going to tip over on that side. Welcome to the second, even though officially first South America project event this semester at GSD. Of course, it is the second because this is the second time Jean-Pierre is here. He was here once, but he was snowed in. He's the only one that showed up to the lecture. The GSD was closed that day. So we're very grateful to have Jean-Pierre Crousse back on a second trial. But of course, this is the first, if not, officially the first lecture for the South America project. Those of you that are not familiar with the South America project, or SAP, as it is well known here, is a transcontinental applied research network that proactively endorses the role of design within rapidly transforming geographies of the South American continent. SAP specifically focuses on how spatial synthesis best afforded by design can provide alternative physical and experiential identities to the current spatial transformations reshaping the South American built environment across multiple scales and design scenarios. This semester, the SAP lecture series, sponsored by the GSD and by the Department of Urban Planning and Design, specifically focuses on contemporary design practices that are broadening the canvas of action of the architect in the region. It is in this context that I am delighted to present today the Peruvian architect Jean-Pierre Crousse, who along with his partner Sandra Barclay, have developed an innovative architectural practice where larger arguments about culture, geography, technology, and environment are heavily questioned through the production of architectural projects and buildings at diverse scales. In examining the many positive qualities of Barclay's and Crousse's work, two elements really seem to stand out. The first has to do with the transatlantic nature of their practice. Founded originally in Paris and then transplanted to their hometown of Lima in Peru, the work developed by this team no longer searches for a singular national or regional identity, a common trait in Latin American architecture from the 80s and 90s, but on the contrary, juxtaposes regional problematics with a much broader and transcontinental disciplinary know-how, allowing for a much richer set of design approaches. And two, while the majority of their work gets resolved at the scale of a building, the spatial ambitions and intentions behind most of their work make bigger claims about the broader landscape in which they sit, opening up an intriguing exploration across scales that range from the architectural detail to the territory. Trained in Peru and Europe, and with over 15 years of professional experience, Sandra and Jean-Pierre have placed themselves as one of the leading architecture studios in Peru and one of the leading offices in South America at large. I am really delighted to have Jean-Pierre here today, and we're looking forward to a fantastic lecture followed by a compelling discussion. So, Jean-Pierre, welcome to the GSD.
Good evening. Thank you to Felipe Correa and Rahul Mehrotra for the invitation. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I was raised in Lima, where more than 60 pre-Columbian temples arise in the urban grid. And they are mostly abandoned. They are covered by earth and dust. And as a kid, I used to go there because it was a magic playground. These hills that hide temples beneath are really significant in Lima. And their presence was a constant in a never-changing city. I like to imagine how architecture built today will look like in 200 or 300 years, supposing, of course, they will not be demolished in an early stage. And I like to imagine a moment in time when our buildings will have only what is permanent. Aging makes buildings lose their shape, like this temple in Lima. I love when, in spite of that, they are still being able to signify space and add meaning to their environment. Some of them blur the boundaries between nature and artifact, between landscape and architecture. Ambiguity and uncertainty are, in those cases, powerful and meaningful terms. In Andean cosmogony, all beings, alive or not, are grouped in three entities: immanent deities, nature, and human beings. Each of them are by essence imperfect, meaning they cannot live separately, they cannot live isolated from each other, and they have to nurture one another and be nurtured in return in order to survive. We're increasingly asking ourselves if territory, landscape, architecture, space, and matter can be seen as relying on each other in the same way and with the same intensity. The cultural dependencies which our Latin American society have had from the dominant European and North American thinking are making us believe it is not possible. Our vision is blurred by our desperate search for the latest technologies, seeking a model of modernity which is not only impractical in our country, but which can even run into conflict with the visions we have about our future. Since Sandra Barclay and myself came back to Peru after 16 years working in France, we're increasingly asking ourselves if we can nurture this kind of imperfection as a possible positive value in a world undergoing global structure transformations. Having shared our professional lives in such diverse locations as Paris and Lima has instilled in us more questions than assurances. From the moment we opened our studio in Paris in 1994 to our return to Peru in 2006, we have had the opportunity to develop a number of projects in both environments. 3 of them triggered some reflections that have allowed us to put into perspective previous undertakings and to set the operative directions of the project that have followed. Paradoxically, these 3 projects, each one separated from 10 years, have imperceptibly taken us from a focus on detail and the building specificity to an obsession with bringing the territory and landscape into architecture. In the same way, our early desire for efficiency, perfection, and precision, which define modern Western society's paradigm, has shifted towards a nurturing of ambiguity and imperfection. The projects I'll share with you are situated in a time span of 20 years and a geographical span of more than 6,000 miles. They redirected our practice, distancing ourselves from the multidisciplinary specialization and bringing us closer to a multi-scale approach. We found an increasingly need to concentrate on the repeated change of focus, going back and forth from the scale of the detail to that of territory. Our first undertaking in France required the transformation of the first Maison de la Culture created by André Malraux into a museum for Impressionist art. The original project by Guy Lagnon and Jean Prouvé, among others, became one of France's first high-tech buildings, taking the technology of the 50s to its limits, as well as the modern concept of flexibility, fluidity, and transparency. We decided to use the technology available in our times to preserve the building's founding concepts, regardless of an important change of use and the radical changes experienced during the past few decades in building regulations and energetic efficiency. And we started with Prouvé's original design for the facade's aluminum profiles in order to preserve its essence and at the same time adapting to the new insulation and windproof standards. We had the enormous chance to work with Jean Prouvé's grandson, Nicolas Prouvé, working at that time for Europe. He helped us design the new fittings with exactly the same dimensions. And we set off from that detail and ended with a close relationship between the interior space, the sea, and the mouth of the port of Le Havre in a similar strategy applied to multiple scales. Not being quite aware of its importance, we introduced to this process a factor of indetermination that wasn't in the briefs. The building skin could be absorptive of the Norman landscape, constant changes in luminosity, which so inspired the painters of the end of the 19th century. When viewing Impressionist works, the visitor to this museum can witness these light variations in the same way as the painters themselves saw them at the time of recreating them on the canvas. After its completion in 1999, some people considered this quality an imperfection, another imperfection, not the one I was telling you. And it cost us various lawsuits and even the risk of bankruptcy. 10 years later, from our Parisian studio, we had the opportunity of designing a small beach house on the Peruvian coast, the X house. We were here and we were just about to make a project down there. The location is situated in the middle of the tropics, 11 degrees south from the equator. To understand how we approach to this 1,800 square foot project, we were compelled to make a zoom out in scale. And in order to understand why this zoom out is important, we have to introduce color. And we realized that the Peruvian coast harbors the coldest tropical seawater temperatures at such close latitude to the equator. If we add the effects caused by the Andes Mountains, as it appears on this magnificent drawing by Alexander von Humboldt, the scientist who named the sea current coming from the South Pole, things keep changing from normal conditions in a tropical setting. Instead of the tropical climate we should expect, we find ourselves in a totally barren landscape, and yet a very humid one. Let's say we redraw the Humboldt section and include the sea bottom. We first draw the ocean line, then the shape of the earth below and above sea level. And we have a vertical territory with a 33,000 feet gradient in a distance of only 125 miles. These geographical circumstances generate a unique landscape and a unique climate. Seawater convection and air thermic inversion combine to create an almost permanent cloud over the desert strip, a very arid and a very humid one. We can say absence is its main condition. Absence of rain, but also of sunshine most of the year. Absence of wind and extreme temperatures, as you can see here. There is no hot, no cold. Absence of well-defined seasons, a climate which fits almost perfectly in the comfort zone. If we compare it with that of New York City, for instance. After I was stuck here for 3 days in Cambridge due to February storms, I don't even dare to compare it with Boston. No? We live in a misty desert with no shadows and no contrast because of the lack of sun. We even endure the absence of horizon of the horizon line when we look west towards the Pacific Oceans. It is hard to imagine Lima as a tropical city, isn't it? We can say that the biggest absence is that of weather itself, in which case architecture loses one of its major reasons for existence, to provide shelter. Without the need for shelter, only the creation of intimacy, which allows life in a vast and absolute territory, is left to architecture. For our first project in Peru, the X House, we found it was a wonderful opportunity to introduce sense to our architecture, taking into account these considerations. We thought ancient Peruvians, which inhabited this region, understood this already. And we were fascinated searching, like archaeologists, for design strategies that are still valid nowadays. The first house is located here in a totally barren landscape defined by a series of coves which outline the way the Andes reach the sea. 100-foot high cliff delimits the vast expanses of sand from the ocean. We found the pre-Columbian strategies of making an enclosure and building a platform could be the project's two basic elements, which could provide intimacy in an extremely abstract landscape and help define a new ground for life. The distance between our studio in Paris and this place forced us to take a strategic decision which would influence our future projects, to despoil the building of all elements which need complex fabrication or close supervision for its successful execution. Not needing to build a shelter, space and the essentiality of the elements that shape it should guarantee the building's quality and not necessarily its correct execution. To allow the use of local labor with limited technical training, we employed traditional reinforced concrete structural skeleton and brick infills. We plastered and painted all surfaces, eliminating all superfluous details. By doing this, we realized we were approaching the logic of excavated matter found in pre-Columbian ruins. And by uniformly painting the surfaces, and by reducing the color palette to ochres, we managed to avoid the building's visual aging in the desert, where great quantities of dust are deposited in all horizontal and even vertical surfaces. The house became an experiment on the possibilities of the absence of weather. The enclosure defines the space for intimacy in front of the desert's infinite space. But this enclosure is permeable, allowing landscape to get into architecture, rather than considering architecture as an object in the landscape. The platform sets a new ground, an artificial beach delimited by the pool. Needing greater intimacy, the bedrooms are located beneath it and are connected by an open stair which ends in this floating pool. This small project represented for us an opportunity for operational freedom, which we did not have in France at that time. We were at that moment in a trial because some few days during summer, the museum temperature, the museum we saw some minutes ago, exceeded only 2 degrees from the established standard for museums. So you can imagine, with no flashing, no insulation, no heating, no air conditioning, no leaks, and for instance, no insurance companies, and no future trials expected for this house, we had so much fun drawing things we know they are forbidden in Europe. Also here. No? This freedom we felt prompted us our return to our birthplace 4 years later. Many of the projects that followed, once we were back in Peru, obeyed to these same strategies. The peculiarity of the territory in which we had to operate increasingly dictated the main design decisions. Nurturing territory, landscape, and architecture as equivalent matters became then a necessity. The Paracas Culture Site Museum project was an attempt to introduce landscape logic into architecture. We learned to read landscape not only as a physical environment, but also as an historical and cultural entity that determine architectural and urban decisions. Shortly after it was finished, we won the competition for our third triggering project, the Place for Remembrance in Lima. Once again, we had to change the scale of observation in order to understand the new logics we were about to employ. The project was started by the Commission for Truth, which investigated the period of political violence that costed 70,000 deaths between 1980 and 2000. The Peruvian writer and Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa launched an architectural competition which sought the creation for a cultural center for reconciliation for Peruvian people. The center would link and put in a common network all the memory museums created by the Association of Victims of this extremely violent conflict. We wondered, when we did this project, how could we possibly begin to design it with this really heavy burden? The answer was on memory, but the kind of memory only architecture can handle, the memory of place and the memory of the building itself. Again, understanding territory was the clue. Apart from the Andes and its oceans, what defines the South American landscape are its river basins, manifesting marked differences between the Atlantic and Pacific watersheds. The Atlantic watershed holds 5 major basins, while the Pacific holds a lot of short rivers. There are 52 in Peruvian coast alone. These rivers form small valleys, which became fertile through human intervention during the past 8,000 years. They can be understood as transversal oases. If we draw the coast like a vertical line which separates the ocean on the west from the desert on the east, we find a regular pattern, a sequence of Andes headlands and transversal oases, about 18 to 25 miles away. If we jump to a different scale and focus on one of them, the Rimac River oasis where Lima is settled, we find a fractal landscape where ravines replace the valleys and cliffs replace the Andes headlands. The 18-mile span reduces to 100 feet. Lima is situated there on this fractal landscape over an alluvial plain 100 feet above sea level. And the city grew quite recently to the edge of the cliffs, and public beaches were created at the sea level. And it's here, on that edge, here, that we had the opportunity to build our third project, the Place for Remembrance. The site for the project was donated by the district of Miraflores, and it was a dump truck parking generated by the destruction of one of these successions of cliffs and ravines I just showed you, in order to cut a roadway to the beaches. So if we go back again to our fractal landscape drawing, the site logic appears to be interrupted by the roadway. Embedding the building with the logic of the cliffs with a compact structure, we could reveal the memory of Lima's landscape. And this strategy allowed us also to build in the economy of means and in an environmental logic. A compact structure located near the cliffs helps us reduce the number and the depth of the foundation piles. And by opening the building to the cliff, we could also reduce the noise disturbance generated by passing traffic and protect the interior spaces from direct sunlight. The artificial cliff and the new ravine that is therefore created take us to a territorial logic which physically extends itself throughout the Bay of Lima and eventually relates to the fractal territory. We like to say that the place of remembrance rebuilds the memory of this landscape, nowadays conveyed and menaced by greedy developers. Taking into consideration that the majority of visitors would arrive by public transport down here, the considerable distance and narrowness between the main urban avenue and the site was one of the major problems. We decided that this distance, which in itself carries a time span, should be transformed into an opportunity. The narrow pathway allows us to distance ourselves from the city, to leave daily preoccupations behind, and to get ready for an exhibit which is not easy to assimilate. The visitor is literally submerged in a gap in space between the cliff and the building. The act of descending into this crevice turns gravity into a very explicit force. This space not only echoes the deep valleys which link the Andean landscapes to Lima, but echoes also the traditional footpath from Lima down to the sea. At the bottom of this newly created ravine, there is a marked physical consciousness, a kind of intensified presence. We are no more in a urban setting nor in a natural landscape. The visitor readies himself to enter the exhibition in a performatic pathwalk. The project adherence to the slope was solved with the age-old strategy of Andean cultivation terracing that we call andenes, allowing for independent access to the different cultural spaces, and at the same time created a large platform. This platform offers a public plaza to the citizens of Lima. We propose it as a necessary contribution to a city like Lima, which desperately lacks of democratic open spaces. Inside, the trajectory continues through a ramp, another magnificent device which we architects have in order to manipulate time. The ramp is conceived as a time-slowing device. This ramp takes us all through the exhibition rooms in an ascendant trajectory where time and gravity continue to participate in creating a magnified presence. The bare desert landscape and the absence of weather allows the building to get rid of skins, layers of insulation, and everything that is not essential for qualifying space. And as we reach the roof, a space open to the sky acts as the last exhibition space. It is dedicated to the construction of the intimate and personal memory of the people who suffered during this time, as seen here in the competition render. And as we ascend, we rediscover the horizon, which is not perceived in the same way after the visit. Of course, when we manage to see it, no? Not every day we see the horizon. From this new ground, the visitor returns to the city, and distance allows us to gradually re-enter our daily routines. The bareness of the building reveals the traces of its construction, and by doing so, we reveal the human work behind it. Being aware that in our country the quality of public construction is very poor, we follow the same approach as we did in the X house. The building's strength must not lay in the finishings, nor in a well-executed building. The choice of reinforced concrete as building material allowed us to reproduce the matter found in the cliff's alluvial strata, merging with its mass and hue. Making use of artisanal formwork assembled by hand, using old wooden planks, we avoided the use of a crane, employed more workers, and introduced indetermination that lovingly adopted all the true imperfections which are produced by neglect or human error. This is the guardian dog of the site. It followed us everywhere. And we learned to appreciate buildings as living beings. Doing so, cracks in polished cement can be seen as a positive way to witnessing aging. We wonder if these things can be no longer considered as construction defects. It's wonderful. The irregular walls are evidence of human labor. Their prints and traces become part of architecture. They become part of the memory of the building process. At left, you can see the footprints of the guardian dog. You just saw it. And we insisted to keep them in the stamped cement floor of the ramp. At right, the workers put their hands in the entry to the public terraces as a trace of the hands who literally built this place. And by doing this, we allow random, chance, or whatever we can call indetermination to participate in the process of building, having much care, nevertheless, not to depend on it to achieve a good result. Allowing indetermination to surprise us, we give a chance for wonder. And producing wonder in architecture is usually beyond our capacity as architects. The same happens with other materials, like, for example, the cobblestones obtained in situ and arranged by hand, in which workers can express freely their skills. To adapt industrial materials like glass to a surface which has been modeled by hand, the simplest gesture becomes the most appropriate. Like this cut in concrete for fitting and sliding window in a non-so-vertical wall. Many times, a limited budget provides us with difficult-to-find solutions in a world of abundance. Instead of using round glass blocks, we opted for the smallest economical effort and decided to use cheaper honeypots encrusted in these cement panels. We discovered that honeypots reproduce magnificent effects of light and shade, and light inside shade. All that with very limited resources, but with the freedom to propose a solution without being compelled to make extremely expensive tests in order to have certifications. How long will it be possible to have the freedom of invention in architecture instead of resigning ourselves to manage preset ways of buildings? At the Paracas museums, for instance, we used a red pozzolanic cement that is usually employed only in foundations due to salty soil. We use it because of its reddish color It's not expensive at all. And it was burnished by hand following the same technique used on pre-Columbian ceramic pieces exhibited inside. The building, with its color and its abstraction, established a friendly dialogue with its landscape, which is at the same time extremely strong and fragile. Local craft traditions always give us clues about forgotten or undervalued materials. The building industry is one of the main culprits, I think, for this forgetfulness or for the obsolescence of certain materials through its most fearful instruments, that are construction regulations and legislation. The particular needs for our local context make this traditional approach to the architectural project possible. The notions of energy efficiency, for example, are irrelevant in such climate as this, and the fragile social structure leave gaps through which we can attempt to escape from established conceptions. And these local conditions have driven us in time from an obsession for detail, controlling efficiency and trusting in the pairing of technology and architecture, to an attraction for nurturing imperfection as a quality for architecture, giving to territory and landscape the role of founding elements. Even as this shift was made little by little, the X house was indeed a turning point. In fact, the factor of indetermination due to the distance triggered this change in how we face the design process, going back and forth from landscape to detail without much difficulty. These three projects I have shown you have taken us to imagine, as we like so much to do, how would they look like in 100, 200 or 300 years' time. In the case of the French Museum, we managed to keep the identity of its space through its radical changes in technology. In the case of the X house and the place of remembrance, space will be the same. The future ruin will differ little from what we see today. Technology is the first thing to change, also the first to disappear in time, outdated. Space, when nurtured by landscape and territory, become the clue in this resilience. Even if the building will cease to host the program that gave it reason to be, even if windows, furniture, lighting, or railings will be victims of time, space will endure, still being able to signify landscape and adding meaning to territory. Focusing on space, architecture frees itself from determination and from the seeking for perfection and the illusion of control, allowing landscape get into it. Space and time, architecture and landscape are mutual friends, I think. Let's nurture their friendship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Pierre. Is this on? Yeah. Please sit down. That's the interrogation seat. No, thank you so much. I think this was really a phenomenal presentation, and I think directly on target on what the larger mission of SAP and I think the larger mission of this lecture series is. So following on that, on sort of what you were sort of mentioning at the beginning, which has to do with sort of in a way, this transition over the span of 20 years from efficiency to architectural effect, right? Moving away from sort of the quantitative in many ways into the qualitative elements of architecture and the way that sort of architecture becomes less about the efficiency of space and more about the quality of certain spaces. What would you say within this sort of larger transatlantic dialogue? What would you say were the qualities that are were worthwhile sustaining within this dialogue? Of course, we release efficiency, but what was kept from your sort of larger transatlantic experience? How did it allow you to see differently the landscape of Peru and the geography where you were working?
Yeah, it was, in effect, the perspective it gave to live in a place and working in another one. I think that was the clue, because when we were like doing the projects of X House, we were confronted at the same time with the problems we usually have in industrial countries. So it was like a play between these two worlds that we had to manage at the same time. And the X House being the first project that we did in Lima, it was like going to the shrink. No, it was like thinking about our childhood, our way of life, the things we didn't understand when we were studying architecture in Lima, and how this magnificent climate, I think the absence of climate is sometimes hard, but it's a real opportunity for architecture. So working in both places gave us really the chance for for comparison. I think that was the clue.
I think following up on I think these sort of all of these points that you're raising, I think another issue that for me is interesting throughout the presentation has to do with the role of the institution, and primarily the institution that actually sort of sponsors certain pieces of architecture. So in the case of the first project and the last project, they're both museums, right? But they're sponsored through very, very different mindsets. So I wonder if you can sort of speak a little bit about the mindset of the institutions that commissioned those, and what was your working relationship, and how that sort of affected the sort of the production of architecture.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that these two museums were issued from national competitions, but in a very special organization of this, because since we had a very liberal, I don't know if you use the term that in English, but liberal economy, we architects ended without being able to design public buildings, because competitions are, I exaggerate a little bit, but they are forbidden in Peru. And these competitions were possible because there were European funding behind. And in the case of the Paracas Museum was the European Union that gave money to rebuild the pre-existing museum after it fell apart in an earthquake. And in the place for Remembrance, it was mostly German funding, which allowed us to allow the Commission of Truth to launch a competition, a national competition, because it was, for Peruvian government, it was like a private competition. It was foreign funding. So And that allowed us to be really free designing these buildings.
Very good. I think with this we can actually maybe open it up to the audience and take questions that we might have from the back. Are there any questions? On the right side of the room? Not one? Raul? Any questions?
Hi.
Sorry, I think there's one back there.
How you think that the French experience impact your work? Like, it was pretty much one of the triggers of your career and experience in the international experience. How important that was for you?
It was really important because we were trained. We studied in a country which it has nearly no regulations, no industry, and very little social coherence. And working in France teaches us how to manage the complexity in the design process. In Peru, it's very simple. There are not so much actors. And in France, we are confronted with many actors, many different interests, economical interests, building processes, etc. And that allowed us to compare, as I said. It's very different when you can build in both places. So it was really working in France gave us the idea to see Peruvian context as an opportunity, and even though we have very little budgets, very little resources, and very little span of material or building processes, we learned to take them as opportunities.
Another question up there.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. It's really gorgeous, and I'm totally blown away. But I find it so amazing the way that from a distance you're able to design in a kind of indeterminacy or a kind of imperfection with the way that you pre-design the kind of techniques that will be applied to the building of a wall or something like that. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about that experience of designing without knowing exactly how it's going to turn out, but trying to design the process so that it seems to always end up very beautiful.
Thank you. So it was, we were compelled to make a strategy when we designed our first house in Peru, because we were not going to be able to go to the site or to decide things that are usually set up in the site. No? So this strategy compelled us to concentrate in space. We just wondered what was the constant in architecture in this climate, and the constant was producing space, producing intimacy. So how can we control space with very little elements in order that space endures any changes in, for example, little errors or imperfection of building, etc. And also, we we chose to build in the traditional way, with modern materials, but the same way the people of that place used to build. So there was not a strange technology that they were not used to build in this project. So, and for example, the cobblestones which we begin using there, it was, for example, an ancient tradition that was already lost, and lost in architecture, but not lost in how do you say, in tradition for the workers. The workers knew very well how to do it, but they never were able to do it in some other buildings. So it was really thinking about making it simple and allowing indeterminations to occur. We just said that no error was to be corrected. So the building, as the place for remembrance, shows everything, and space is so preeminent in design process that it doesn't matter if it's not built the way we draw it.
But I think I will take another question in a second. But I think that raises, I think, another very interesting question in your work, which has to do with the limits of this freedom, right? How far can you go? And I think that you showed us, I think, exceptional projects like the house and 2 museums. But what has been your experience? Because, for example, I know that you have multifamily housing projects, right? And what is your experience in working in Lima when you need to involve, I think, a larger set of constituencies, and when the projects, because of their scale, because of their nature, are more complex in terms of their spatial requirements? How does I think this condition of indeterminacy play out in larger scale projects?
Yeah, it's the more complex the projects are, the more difficult to do it. But I think there's always an indetermination in the site process also. So you must have, as everybody knows, a good client, a good contractor, and a good architect to do it. And what we try to do is to set some rules in the site, no? Because we are, of course, obliged to do every detail, to design everything, and to make all the drawings that they ask us. But when we arrive to the site, we try to change rules and to set them at the beginning, and to involve people who are working and the client in this process. This is, of course, not always successful. We can do it every time, but when we can do it, we were very pleased.
I think there was another question over there.
Thank you. I really like your projects, and in the way that they're very like poetic, in a way that is like embedded a sense of your identity in all your projects. And when you talk about the celebration of the imperfection, immediately it reminded me of the Japanese wabi-sabi kind of philosophy, where you're celebrating the decaying of something, but also in that way you celebrate its timelessness. So I'm wondering, like, in terms of the temporal qualities, or like, is there any agenda that related to time in your design, or like other kind of thinking that's like in a broader context?
Yeah, well, we traveled to Japan, and so it was an influence, of course, and but it was also, I think, in when you don't have weather, when you have so little things that determine the project. You don't have to take care about I don't know 40 degrees span between summer and winter in buildings. They don't fall apart as quickly as here, for instance, and so it's much easier to make a simple building that will age the way, more or less, the way we suppose it will age. So in Peru, for instance, people don't like buildings to age. And there's no need to, for instance, here, if it begins to crack, there will be maybe water coming in and damaging structures. Down there, it's not the case. So it can age peacefully, let's say it. And also, another thing that for us was very important was when we did our master in landscape and territory, we were studying Andean cosmogony, and this sense of imperfection, of aging, and making the building dependent on other scales of intervention, like landscape or territory or city. But the city being also dependent of architecture, the interdependency, remind us how people in the Andes think about things, about beings. And that's a very different notion from Western, the Western way of thinking, which we have also. Because instead of considering man or human being superior or away from nature, I think pre-Columbian in North American cultures have more or less the same type of thinking. What's interesting is that they don't consider only as equal nature, deities, and human beings. They are not only equal, but they are, the three of them, imperfect, because they are not able to survive alone. So they have to nurture, man has to nurture nature, and nature nurtures him also. So this equivalent thing, we were wondering how can they be integrated to architecture. And in the Andes, people are still thinking like that. So we're wondering, we haven't had the opportunity yet to work in the Andes. And, but we were thinking about how can we do architecture without imposing itself to landscape, or landscape to teach or to give the only reasons for architecture. No? So it's a work, a multi-scale work, going back and forth.
Any other questions? Farther up, Raul.
Thanks again for a fantastic presentation. And I just want to pick up on some things that have come up, but also what Felipe talked about, patronage in a sense, you know. And I mean, these are very beautiful works, and you chose certain works. He also alluded to the fact that you have more complex projects. So in the museum and the second home, they're sort of soft programs in a sense that the constituent user doesn't impose on it in ways that more complex multifamily houses would do. And then you touched upon the question of everyday practices like the cobblestones and, which exist in everyday life, but somehow don't get formalized within the practice of architecture, these ways of making. I'm just sort of curious, probably this is the work of a critic, not of you, but I'm just sort of curious to ask you how some of these ways of making practices, responses to the landscape and the superimposition or not superimposition, have found their way into more mainstream practice in Peru as a result of these projects and things that you've been doing. I mean, just if you may reflect on that, because finally, I mean, this incredible sensibility, if it finds its way into, let's say, the mainstream and begins to move it, which I think some of your projects have done, I think it's an incredible thing. And so if you have any reflections on that and what you see might have been the influences on, the profession or the practice of architecture in Peru.
Yeah, I think I don't know if this kind of approach can be generalized to all architecture and to the ways architecture is built. Because it demands a shift in thinking about efficiency, about regulations, for example, and certifications, and etc. We are in South America. We are obsessed with copying what is done here in industrial countries. And for instance, for example, regulations are literally copied from here. And there are still gaps in which we can go in. And I think it's important to think how can we shift minds of not architects but people who set regulations and because I think the problem that we discovered working in France was that construction is dominated by insurance companies, for instance, and no other element. Insurance companies work or industry is married with insurance companies, and all the regulations are not necessarily for human well-being, but for spending less money when you have problems. And so we are trying to change these things in our countries before it gets to that point. No? So we are. I don't know really how to be successful doing that, but we're trying to do it, and we are working with people, trying to make them think about this preoccupation for progress, for technology, and that it doesn't fit quite well in our countries.
But I think following up on Raul's question, I think another angle to look at that has to do with, I think, your activity as an educator. And I think you've been teaching in Lima for the past 10 or 15 years. So maybe you could also touch on how many of these ideas have translated into architectural pedagogy in your eyes? How do you actually sort of formulate a sort of an academic agenda in the context of these experiences?
Yeah, we in our studio in Lima, we try to first of all find projects where nobody thinks an architect is useful there. So we are mounting an agenda of infrastructure projects where there will be no architects, surely, in Peru. And we're trying to make connections with government instances in order that we can show them that seeing the same problems, the same how do we locate infrastructure in the territory can change a lot if there's a view from architecture or from landscape. So, and then also we are doing that, and in parallel we are working in matter with matter. So, in details or in construction process that try to defy for example, regulations by taking old materials and rethink the old materials in contemporary ways, or the vice versa. So there are like experiences in the scale of territory and at the same time in the scale of detail, and then we try to get to the middle. So it's like a parallel work trying to join. But for me, the most important thing is that the students be aware of the possibilities of architecture in places where architecture is not expected.
Very good. Are there one last question? No? Okay, I think this has really been an exceptional session. I think we've seen not only incredible pieces of architecture, but I think I think one thing that was quite magnificent was the way that you can actually use your buildings to construct particular essays about a position in architecture, and I think that was absolutely phenomenal. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to having more conversations like these.
Thank you, Felipe.